Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.61, The Beginning of the Beginning of the End. As 1780 began to come to a close, everybody found themselves growing mighty tired of the War of Independence that was now getting ready to enter its sixth year. The economy of the young nation was a mess, and rampant inflation was plaguing everybody. The war in the North had morphed into an annoying staring contest, as George Washington desperately looked for a chance to get back into the action. Down to the South, Nathaniel Greene had picked up the remnants of the Southern Army that had not been devastated in Camden, and was doing his best to see that they didn't outright starve to death. In order to accomplish this, Greene was required to abandon standard military protocol of the age and divide an already outnumbered force. Greene and Daniel Morgan were in command over the two parts of an already depleted force. They were separated from each other by over 100 miles, and in the middle was Lord Cornwallis and a British army. For the first half of our episode today, though, I'm going to let Greene and Morgan sweat it out, as they both try to figure out their next move. We'll finish up with Morgan later on today. Before we get to that, though, I feel that it is time that we spend at least some time with our commander. Because really, for the last several weeks, George Washington just has not been a huge part of our story. This is not necessarily his choosing. Washington wanted a fight. He was desperate for one. But rather that nobody seemed interested in giving him that fight, nor in the case of the French, helping him go out and pick the fight himself. George Washington's army was disgruntled as they entered into their winter quarters in Middletown in 1780. We have talked about the reasons for these hard feelings back in episode 4.59, so I'm not going to rehash them all here, but suffice it to say that nobody was in what you would call a great mood. If you will recall from that episode, this frustration boiled over in May 1780, when two regiments of the Connecticut line decided that the time was right for a mutiny. Although the situation never really got too far, it was at a minimum a concerning development for Washington. It spoke directly to just how fed up the common soldiers were becoming. While the mutiny remained limited in scope, everybody was well aware that they were far from the only men who had become disenchanted with the idea of soldiering. Washington and company were certainly crossing their fingers that the mutiny of the Connecticut line would prove to be an isolated event. And it was. Right up until January 1781. Far more serious than the mutiny of the Connecticut line. This newest mutiny hit Pennsylvania at the start of the year and came as a result of some murky wording and a deep sense of unfair dealings from the Pennsylvania troops. The problem came from how sign-ups to the Continental Army were being conducted. During the earliest part of the war, back in 1775 and 1776, there was a real desperation to get men to enlist. This often meant handing out a bonus to those who signed up. Now, during these early days, it was not rare for sign-ups to be for short commitments, often just 3 months. This policy infuriated Washington because it meant that he had an army that never had a chance to develop those skills critical to fighting a war. Most notably the discipline not to turn and run at the first sign of danger. This is to say nothing of the fact that Washington spent huge amounts of energy back during 1776 trying to keep the army from evaporating at the beginning of 1777. Following his loss on Long Island, Washington expressed to Congress the importance of having men commit to fighting for the duration of the war. After watching the army get kicked around in New York during the summer of 1776, Congress relented and agreed to longer enlistments. In Pennsylvania, recruiters played it fast and loose with their wording, and had people signing up for 3 years or for the war. The problem is that they never really specified what that meant. As it would turn out, those men who enlisted would interpret that mandate as meaning whichever came first, while the leadership believed that it meant whichever came last. Making matters worse is that early on the signing bonuses had been a $20 bounty. As time went on, and finding new and eager men to fight became more and more difficult. that bonus began to creep up. So think about this from the perspective of a guy who signed up in 1776. I signed up early and I got a smaller bonus to thank me than somebody who waited until more recently. Cool, so less money for more time. That's awesome. But hey, at least my 3 years is up and I can go home. Wait, what's that? I have to serve for the duration of the war now? Super awesome. The problem was becoming apparent through 1779. So, trying to save things, Congress agreed to give an additional $100 to anybody who agreed to serve for the remainder of the war. Which, great, now at least the bonus question is mollified. However, where the Army's officers failed was that they often would give the bonus to the men without explicitly letting them know that accepting this seemingly generous $100 bonus meant that they were now signing up to see the war through until the bitter end. Although many understood that they were probably stuck serving until the end of the war and appreciated the money, with only some mild grumbling. There was a considerable number who did not understand that the $100 bonus came with a catch. Angry and fed up with the entire process, the men of the Pennsylvania line decided, on January 1st, 1781, that enough was enough and that they wanted to head to Philadelphia to have what, I am sure, was going to be a polite conversation with Congress about their concerns. 2 men did attempt to talk them down and stop them, and in exchange they were killed for their trouble. This was a bad situation. There was now an angry, armed and trained contingent of men walking towards the young nation's capital. Everybody involved understood that this situation was fraught with danger. The commander of the Pennsylvania line, Anthony Wayne, did what he could to stop the line from reaching Philadelphia. However, he was worried enough that he sent word to Congress that it might be a good idea for them to get out of town quickly. Wayne desperately tried to convince the men to pause their march, and instead agreed to moving to Trenton, which the men rebuffed. However, they did agree to a meeting in Princeton. When the meeting occurred, the order of the day was to end the mutiny by all means necessary. 2 representatives from the Pennsylvania Executive Council readily agreed to discharge any man who claimed that he thought he was signing up for a 3-year stint. No proof was needed on the part of the man making the claim. Their word would suffice because really, what other options did they have? This was not a small group either. It represented nearly 15% of Washington's army. Many of the men would end up discharging and then turning right back around and re-enlisting in order to secure themselves a new, larger enlistment bonus. It is important to realize that the men involved in this mutiny were American patriots who were committed to the cause. When General Clinton attempted to entice the mutineers to jump sides, the men captured his emissaries and handed them over to officials. These 2 men were subsequently hanged. These men were not wanting to give up the cause of independence. To that, they were as committed as ever. What they were fighting for was fair treatment, something that they felt they had been denied. Washington, even as he encouraged the states to provide better for their men, was displeased with the response to give so readily into the demands of the mutineers. Sure, Washington felt for the plight of the men, but this was a war and a mutiny was the ultimate threat to discipline. After all, what would happen if the lenient response to the Pennsylvania line gave other companies ideas? Washington was right to be concerned about this because, in fact, the treatment of the Pennsylvania mutineers did give others ideas. On January 20th, a mutiny broke out amongst the New Jersey troops looking to emulate their Pennsylvania brethren. Rather than concessions, however, the New Jersey mutineers were met with apoplectic rage. George Washington was going to regain control over his army, and was determined to make clear what happened to people who threatened that control. Writing to Israel Shreve, the man who informed him of the mutiny on January 21st, Washington did not mince words, stating that this affair, if possible, must be brought to an issue favorable to subordination, or the army is ruined. I shall therefore immediately march a detachment from these posts to quell the mutineers. Robert Howe, who had moved north to take control of West Point following Arnold's treason, was sent out to crush the uprising. 12 men were arrested and were given the task of acting as the firing squad for two of the ringleaders. Washington would write to William Livingston on January 27th that the New Jersey Mutiny had been awed into an unconditional surrender, and that following the show of force, there appeared to be a genuine repentance amongst the men. There would not be a further large-scale outbreak of mutiny. The events that had led to the quelling of the New Jersey uprising seemed to have gotten the point across. However, entering 1781, George Washington was in a downright dour mood. The uprisings that January had left him seriously doubting his ability to hold the army together and prophesizing the coming doom of the country. The British, seeing cracks in the foundation of the Americans, were finally feeling pretty good about everything. If Washington's great victory in the war had been keeping an army in the field, this dissension in the ranks boded well for British prospects. We will leave George Washington up north to fret over his army for now, and head back down to the south to link up with Nathanael Greene. Although Washington was wiping sweat from his brow at his situation, as of right now the main theater of the war remained in the south, where, if you will recall, Greene had split his army in order to keep them fed. Greene remained with the bulk of the army while Daniel Morgan took some 600 men and moved off to the southwest. Daniel Morgan is, at least in my opinion, one of the most interesting figures on the American side in the Revolution. He never really seemed to ascend into that upper echelon of revolutionary military leaders, generally remaining in the shadows of men like Knox and Greene. However, what he does develop is a bit of a reputation as being almost something of a folk hero. He proved, time and time again, that he was a capable leader, and that he seemed to have a keen military mind. This can almost lead us to the impression, especially based on what is going to happen next, that Morgan was some renegade running into battles and emerging victorious despite nearly impossible odds. This is reinforced by the fact that, allegedly, Morgan was the inspiration for Mel Gibson's character in The Patriot. Knowing that, I want to make clear that Daniel Morgan was not particularly interested in picking a fight with the British in early 1781. In fact, Morgan felt that his position could not be held and wanted to withdraw into Georgia, only to be vetoed by Greene, who did not want to disrupt the current situation. You see, Cornwallis had decided that the best move was to eliminate Morgan's flying column. To accomplish this task, he turned to the growing American boogeyman in Tarleton, who was coming to trap Morgan in between the two armies. Now, the prudent plan for Cornwallis would have been to just wait for his new army up in Virginia, under the command of a man whom we're going to talk about next time, to get settled in and then move south to catch Greene's army in a pincer maneuver. The problem was that Cornwallis decided that such patience was unnecessary. Instead, he would let Tarleton head off to crush Morgan, which would, in turn, allow Cornwallis the ability to go knock Greene out of the war. So, since apparently nobody was interested in following their military textbooks, Cornwallis decided to divide his own army to deal with the Americans. Conditions that January were difficult for both armies. A huge amount of rain had fallen during January, meaning that the rivers were flooded. This made the prospect of fording these fast-moving, unpredictable waterways that much more dangerous. Ironically, the poor conditions had Cornwallis thinking that Tarleton's pursuit of Morgan had probably stalled out, stymied by a mixture of flooded rivers and the muddy terrain that accompanied it. The other problem was that Tarleton was not exactly doing a great job of keeping in touch with Cornwallis, so during mid-January, the Southern general often was unaware of exactly where he was. On January 16th, Tarleton would write to Cornwallis complaining about how much the water had hindered him, and that it had allowed Morgan to get out in time. Cornwallis noted that he believed that by this point Morgan had too much of a head start for Tarleton to reasonably expect to catch up with him. Although Cornwallis was not exactly clear on where Tarleton was at any given time, Daniel Morgan, as it turns out, was. Morgan was having his own difficulties. First, he had expected some help from Thomas Sumter. Evidence suggests that Sumter may have well felt as though he had been skipped over for a command, and that he resented these outsiders now running all around his country. Sumter really did hate Morgan, and even more, he absolutely despised Nathanael Greene. Either way, Sumter had zero intentions of giving any of his resources, neither in terms of supplies or manpower, to Greene or Morgan. If that was not enough of a problem, Morgan was also moving much slower than anybody realized. When Tarleton crossed over the Pacolet River on the 15th, he was only 6 miles from Morgan's army. Making matters worse is that Morgan was traveling with a heavy army, whereas Tarleton was moving light. This all made Morgan come to the unfortunate conclusion that Tarleton was indeed going to overtake him. The problem for Morgan is that he now had to make a decision. Did he want to try to make a run for it? If so, he ran the very real risk of Tarleton catching up to him when it came time to cross the Broad River. We had talked about last time that real worry that the Southern Army had of getting caught with their backs to a river. Tarleton's cavalry running through them while they feebly attempted to ford a river seemed like a pretty poor option, and a recipe for a slaughter. After all, everybody was very well aware of just what kind of quarter Banastre Tarleton gave. With that ruled out, the only other option was to make a stand. Morgan would later state that he chose Cowpens as the place to make his stand, because there was nowhere to retreat. The Broad River was still to their rear, meaning that the men would have no choice but to stand and fight. Although this might have been something of an invention after the fact to explain why he picked a flat meadow, which gave an advantage to the cavalry, something of which Tarleton had far more of than Morgan, it is where Morgan decided to make his stand. What made Morgan's battle plan so brilliant was that he understood the limitations of the militia, and rather than just pretending that they did not exist, he incorporated those limitations into his battle plans. So, what limitation is it that I am talking about? Well, we have been talking about the war now for the last 33 episodes. At this point, if there is any one thing you should know, is that in a battle, the militia was pretty likely to just turn and run, as opposed to stand and fight. There was a reason that the majority of the leadership during the war, Washington and Greene included, did not trust the militia. They were necessary during the war. However, necessary does not mean that they were reliable. Knowing that the militia was going to end up taking off when the danger got a little bit too real for their liking, Morgan incorporated that fact into his plan. He arranged his men into 3 lines. In the first line, there were approximately 150 sharpshooters who were members of the militia. Behind them was another line, again made up of militia. Finally, there was a third line in the rear that was made up of a mixture of Continentals and Virginia militia. Behind all of them, there was a small reserve under the command of Lieutenant William Washington's cavalry. Among the most serious risks for Morgan was that Washington's 80 or so men were all the reserves that he had available. So if things went sideways, he did not really have much in the way to throw forward to plug up the gaps. Morgan was well aware that those front 2 lines were likely to melt away when the fighting began. To address this very real problem, he asked just 2 things out of them. First, he needed just 2 volleys to be fired. Second, following those 2 volleys when you inevitably turn and retreat, please keep to the left rather than running pell-mell through the line behind you. Once the men had done that, they were to rendezvous behind the third line, the one containing the Continentals, and form a new line of defense on the high ground behind everybody else. For his part, Tarleton was moving with approximately 1,000 men, roughly an even number to what the Americans had, if not a slight advantage in manpower. As the Americans settled into their defensive posture and waited, Tarleton's men woke up early and began the 4-mile march towards Cowpens, arriving at around 7 a.m. As the British approached, Tarleton struggled to quickly study the American formations, before he went ahead and sent a detachment of cavalry forward to clear the path and dispense with those pesky Americans. The militia in the front line did exactly what Morgan had asked for them to do, and as the British cavalry drew near, they unleashed a volley that tore through the ranks. This was a devastating blow, and just as quickly as they had come, the survivors of that first encounter turned and raced back in retreat. The American first line, having done their jobs perfectly, followed orders and made an orderly retreat. Tarleton, now probably a bit surprised but not yet deterred, stopped the retreat and ordered the men on horseback to form up battle lines. It is here that historian John Buchanan writes in his book, The Road to Guilford Courthouse, The American Revolution in the Carolinas, that Tarleton made a critical error. Following that first encounter where the Americans had caused so much damage to his cavalry, at no point does Tarleton slow down to think through his situation. He never was able to finish the study of the American lines. He did not consult the commanders about the situation. He didn't even bother to wait until the entire army had taken the field. Rather, and seemingly without having really thought it through, he ordered his infantry to advance forward towards that second line. Unlike Tarleton, the American second line showed their patience and held their fire as the British advanced towards their position. Once in range, that second line fired their first volley, reloaded, and then fired again. Now, here things did get a bit more dicey for the Americans. Despite the 2 volleys doing significant damage, their orderly retreat was less than orderly, as the British charge managed to catch up with the American line before they could pull all the way back. Now, the militia was engaged in often brutal hand-to-hand combat, which was not exactly what Morgan was hoping for. Knowing that the situation could come apart, he decided to use his, albeit limited, reserves and ordered Washington and the American cavalry forward. This worked well, with the British taking heavy casualties. So far, so good. Now, twice repulsed, Tarleton ordered his reinforcements forward to help deal with that American third line. Now, at this point, things were really not going great for Tarleton. The battle had thus far been going for just around 15 minutes, and twice he had seen his men retreat. As this new wave of men began to approach the American third line, a line which contained Continentals in the center and militia on their flanks, Morgan fell back behind the third line to help assist South Carolina militia commander Andrew Pickens rally the militia. Recall that the plan had always been for those first 2 lines to fall back and form a new line behind the third line. Morgan, however, was not blind to the fact that many of the retreating militia might fail to rally and just keep retreating. After all, not that much time had passed since the debacle at Camden. Although some men did exactly that and just kept going, Morgan and Pickens did an admirable job at halting any potential exodus and forming the militia back up into a new rear line. The American Third Line, under the command of John Howard, had a serious problem now. The approaching British line was longer than the American line, which, that is indeed a pretty big problem. Things, however, are not going swimmingly for the British either. After seeing the first 2 lines retreat, the British likely expected the same response from the third line. Much to their dismay, however, the third line just stayed put and kept firing on the approaching British. Still, though, the American right was in very real danger of being outflanked. Howard tried to prevent this by ordering the militia on his far right to turn and attempt to prevent themselves from being outflanked. Unfortunately, this went poorly. It was a difficult maneuver at the best of times, let alone under enemy fire. Confusion took over, and the American right began to slowly retreat. Critically, however, and to Howard's credit, the retreat was slow and orderly, rather than something like the panic-induced fleeing that came during the Battle of Camden. It was here, at this moment, that the British made their biggest miscalculation of the day. Thinking that the American right was now falling apart, the British broke ranks and surged forward to try and smash the American line. The problem here was twofold. Despite some sweaty palms for Daniel Morgan, the American right was not exactly collapsing as much as it was just doing a little bit of bending, with Tarleton thinking that the British were about to win an unexpectedly difficult victory. He was given a very unwanted surprise. The British had believed that the retreat of the first two lines was not as much a planned event as it was a repeat of Camden. The militia were spooked and they took off. Imagine their surprise, therefore, when an unexpected fourth line of Americans, who were hidden behind that slight ridge, were ordered forward by Morgan and Howard, and they fired into the charging and disorderly British advance. This was pretty much the end of the battle. The American attack had caught the British completely by surprise, and quickly, confusion turned into fear. Into this chaotic situation, Morgan ordered Washington and the cavalry back out as they attacked the British flanks. The American militia under Perkins followed behind and kept up a steady rate of fire on the now completely overwhelmed British. With events quickly moving towards a general slaughter, men quickly began surrendering. It was a stunning victory for Morgan and the Americans. American losses stood at a dozen killed with another 60 wounded. In comparison, the British had 100 dead, 200 wounded, and at least another 600 captured. The vast majority of the army that Tarleton had entered the day with were now either dead, injured, or captured. Following that period where everything had seemed to be going wrong for the Americans, they had just secured a critical victory that would bring with it major repercussions. The victory at Cowpens was about as complete a victory as the Americans had achieved in years. While I'm sure that Morgan would have liked to take a break and celebrate his victory, there was no time for that. Cornwallis was not amused when he learned about Tarleton's defeat. Rather than stew in his defeat, however, Cornwallis quickly decided that it was time to flex his manpower advantage and destroy Morgan once and for all. Now, more than being motivated by thoughts of revenge, what Cornwallis was really after was recovering those 800 or so prisoners that the Americans had taken during the battle. Cornwallis quickly resolved that the order of operations would be heading out to smash Morgan before turning around and taking care of Greene. Not that this was going to be an easy thing for Cornwallis. Military strategy would dictate that if you are attempting to catch up with an enemy force for a rescue mission, you would send out the light infantry. Light infantry moves faster than a regular army, and ideally would have been able to hold Morgan up enough that the slower-moving bulk of Cornwallis's army would have had a chance to catch up. The problem was that the British light infantry was now either lying dead in a field at Cowpens, or were captives of the American army. Cornwallis came up with the solution of just turning regular infantry into light infantry. How did he accomplish this task, you ask? Easy. You just burn all of the things that slow them down. Pesky things like boats, food, baggage, and, most infuriatingly for the men, the rum supply. See? Much lighter now. Understanding that this would be a bitter pill for many of the men, he did put a literal carrot at the end of the stick and sent food via the Navy to Wilmington, North Carolina. All the men needed to do to get the food was to get to Wilmington, destroying the Americans in their path. What ensued over the coming weeks was a cat-and-mouse chase between the two armies. Morgan may have felt great about Cowpens, but he had zero interest in getting caught up in a fight with a much larger army under Cornwallis. This is not to say that the Americans failed to take shots at their British pursuers. Morgan would halt his army and spend some time taking shots at them as they attempted to ford rivers. But as soon as the British began to fight back, he would just continue his retreat. Nathaniel Greene, although taking some satisfaction in watching his nemesis learn just how difficult living off the land in the Carolinas was also well aware of the danger that Morgan was now in. Although dividing the two armies a few months before had proven to work well, it was time for everybody to get back together. The two American armies would rendezvous in North Carolina, where the two armies would proceed north together towards Virginia. The finish line of this race was the Dan River, which was located right along the North Carolina-Virginia border, and the reinforcements that reaching Virginia would provide. With the Americans having made it across the Dan and Cornwallis not wanting to challenge for the north bank of the river, he made the decision to pull back to Hillsborough. It was while in Hillsborough that he put out a proclamation calling for all of those loyalists to come help him restore order to the country. Although Greene received reports that this proclamation was a huge success and that people came flocking to the British cause, the truth was much different. Between Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and now this race across North Carolina for the Dan River, the British had taken their share of licks. They weren't not out of the fight by any means, but also, they were not exactly having a good time either. The chase through North Carolina had not produced any major battles, but both sides engaged in numerous skirmishes that had left dead and injured in their wake on both sides. For any of those loyalists who might have given a thought to getting involved, suddenly that was looking like a much more dicey prospect. The British might still manage to win the war, at least in the Carolinas. But also, now, there is a real chance that they don't. Risking their lives for a war whose outcome now seemed to be in question, well, that seemed like an awfully risky endeavor. Therefore, the real consequence of all of this is that, contrary to the poor intelligence that Greene was getting, Loyalists were pretty much done with the war in the South. When the British had started their Southern strategy, the assumption, at least back in London, was still that most Americans remained loyal to their king, and that they would turn out in droves to fight for the British. Those on the ground, and like Henry Clinton, smiled and nodded along with company policy, but they were also much less optimistic. Sure enough, recruiting loyalist militiamen had proven to be a difficult task. Now, however, the task was no longer difficult. It was virtually impossible. This will, as we are going to see moving forward, have a profound effect on the ability of the British to continue conducting the war. Somewhat ironically, Greene would find himself very stressed out by the reports that the British ranks were swelling as they collected more and more loyalist fighters. Greene too had gotten reinforcements heading into March, and now boasted an army of around 4,400 men. With his own army growing and now desperate to staunch the flood of loyalists, apparently joining up with Cornwallis, Greene decided that it was time to confront the British. On February 23rd, Greene and his army would go back across the Dan into North Carolina. Over the next few weeks, the two armies would carefully maneuver around each other. During this time, the American army continued to grow as reinforcements showed up to join Greene. Confident that his army was now larger than that of Cornwallis's, on March 14th, Greene moved his army to Guilford Courthouse, then a small village in what has since become part of Greensboro, North Carolina. It is here that Greene and Cornwallis will confront each other in a battle that will set the stage for the final part of the war. Next time, we will pick up exactly where we are leaving off today, as the Americans and the British prepare to face off. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time for the Battle of Guilford Courthouse.